Hello and welcome to the video. This video is a little bit different from some of the others that you may have seen on the channel. Normally it's me kind of building stuff and showing how to get the best out of the technology in the hobby. This one is part of the series about fixed wings for multi-rotor pilots. Now, if you look at those videos, there's loads of videos in there already that if you're a multi-rotor pilot and you want to try fixed wing, but you may be struggling or not sure what you need to think about, it's all in there already. But this is James. James is one of my Patreons. He was in that situation. He's a great multi-rotor pilot looking to move into fixed wing and really having a tough time. Destroyed several models and was starting to lose the will to live with the whole thing and just about to give it up. So he contacted me and said, look, can you give me some advice? Turns out he lives relatively close to me, about an hour and a half away. So we got a date in the diary and I went down and spent some time with him. And within 90 minutes of me turning up at his house, we had configured the radio, we'd configured the plane, and he'd actually had his first successful flight and he was grinning like a man possessed. So what I want to do in this video is share, for those of you that don't have access to somebody who can come along and kind of show you the ropes, what I did in that 90 minutes to take James from somebody who was really struggling to fly to somebody who had had his first successful flight. In fact, after that first little bit of video that I've just shown you there, he went on to then launch, fly and land the model successfully as well. So let me break down in easy steps. So if you're in that situation and you're in the same position as James and just getting really frustrated with the whole fixed wing thing, but you can fly multi-rotors, let me talk about what I did. First thing before we do that, let me reiterate a couple of things that I've already covered in the other model talking about making planes easier to fly. And that is, it's really, really important that you have the right model. Buying a scale Spitfire or a really expensive Campaigner 2 or those kind of things, while they're beautiful models, are probably not best for new pilots. Crashing is absolutely part of learning and you will smash the heck out of your first couple of models. In fact, speaking as a pilot that's been flying for a very long time now, I occasionally still smash the heck out of stuff that I get now. But the initial stages, you're pretty much guaranteed that more often than not, it's going to end in disaster. So getting a nice cheaper foam plane that you can put together with hot glue is really important. I recommend getting something like a Bixler or a Skywalker, something that's got a reasonably high wing where the motor is mounted on the back, out the way of all the disaster. Something that doesn't have landing gear, or if it does have landing gear, don't fit it, because belly landing and skidding is an awful lot easier. And in the early stages of learning to fly, it's all about gaining the confidence to be able to continue and getting hold of some of the basic controls. So my advice would be, make sure you have the right model. Most of you that are flying multi-rotors are going to have a Taranis or similar radio, and that's brilliant for fixed wing. But if you're looking to try and learn with a scale Spitfire or a really, really twitchy model wing or something else, that's probably not the place to start. That's probably your second or third model. Now, the model that had been set up was pretty good on the radio. All the basics were there. And again, have a look at my simple plane setup for OpenTX, because that has an awful lot more information on this. But all I did was have a look at the model. Everything was set up. All the controls were moving in the right direction. But the first thing I did was add exponential to the aileron, elevator and rudder. I added about 30%, which most people go, oh, that's quite high, but this is a beginner plane. Added 30% to the elevator and aileron, about 15-20% to the rudder. That should get us started. Now that's going to make the sticks around the middle position a lot less sensitive. Now Betaflight has those kind of curves and exponential in it already. You need to add that into the radio if you're using fixed wing, because there's no flight controller to do that for you. And it also, just while you're learning, helps you get control of everything. As you get more proficient, you can reduce that amount of expo to a level that you feel more comfortable with, because once you've been flying for a while, that amount of expo will feel quite mushy. But to start out, it just means that it will give you the best possible chance of having a successful flight. Next thing to do is to check that all the surfaces are moving in the right direction. So when you move the aileron to the right aileron should come up, the left aileron should come down, and vice versa, that the rudder moves in the same direction as the rudder control. And when you pull the elevator stick down towards the bottom of the radio, the elevator rises as well. And that's really important to make sure that that's all done, to make sure that something isn't wrong. If it is, reverse it in the mixer or reverse it in the servo part of the OpenTX radio. Once we knew that was okay, then went into the sub trim for the aileron, elevator and rudder, and just used the sub trim to get the control surfaces exactly right. Now, you probably find that when you move a control surface, it doesn't come back to exactly the same position. The servos in the cheaper models aren't super duper, but get it as close as you can. I tend to just run my finger along the top of it just to make sure it's in line. Just move the control again, just make sure it comes back to the same position or as close as you can, and just keep moving the sub trim, do each in turn and make sure you're okay. If you find that when you're doing that, the servos are not at a 90-degree position, and again, I'd refer you back to the simple plane setup for OpenTX video, then make sure you're doing that. On this particular model of James's, the BIX3 that we're using here that he had already, perfect for the training flight. The servos for the ailerons, what we did is we used the channel value until they were both in the same position on the wing and in line, and then we manually adjusted the links so that those control surfaces were spot on and in line with the rest of the control surface. Once we'd done that, the next job then was to check the throws, how much each of the control surface moves. By default, the radio and the model will probably move them too far, which will make the model react quite violently, even with the expo that we've got. So have a look in the manual. There usually be throw recommendations. It's usually kind of 12, 15 millimeters maximum is how much it moves. And that 12, 15 millimeters is if that's the aileron and it moves, if that's 15 millimeters, that's kind of the movement that you're after. So that's how you kind of measure it. Use the travel adjustment or change the percentage. So you know how in the radio everything's at 100%. Reduce that down to, I don't know, maybe 66, 67% or maybe 70, just to reduce the amount of throw and make it so that the controls all move as per the manual. In maiden flights, I tend to also go a little bit less than that, just so that it doesn't catch the new pilot out. Last couple of things then, I normally add a throttle cutoff switch, so flicking the switch that I would normally use for arming, disarming for a multi-rotor overrides the throttle channel with a value of -100, and that means that I have the same switch that I'll immediately go to by default with my experience with multi-rotors and cut the throttle if something nasty starts to happen. Now we've got all that done, and again, don't forget all this stuff is being done without the prop installed on the bench. Next job to do then is to set up the plane and finish all those pieces. Make sure that it's put together, that all the screws are nice and tight, that nothing is loose. Make sure that all the controls are moving nice and freely with the radio. I personally would recommend these Bixler style models because they don't have landing gear. This Bixler 3 had landing gear, so I took it off so it can just coast into the grass and it's not going to grab the landing gear and rip it out. Next thing we need to do is check the central gravity. Center of gravity is something that you don't think about a lot if you're a multi-rotor pilot, but it is absolutely crucial if you're going to be flying a fixed wing. The center of gravity is where the plane naturally rests. It's usually about 1/3 of the distance from the front of the wing. So what we did is we looked in the manual, we measured from the nose of the plane, and the trick I would use if you're not sure how to do that is just get your pal to hold it on the bench with the nose down, with the tail pointing in the air. Get a tape measure and stick the tape measure on the desk, mark off where the central gravity needs to be, get a Sharpie pen or something and just mark on each wing where that should be, and then lay everything down and then put the battery into the nose and then try and balance the plane on those marks on your fingertips. Now with the Bixler 3 and the 2200 3S battery that James had, that wasn't enough weight, so we ended up putting a stack of 2p coins wrapped in tape. We actually hot glued that into the nose that gave him a perfect central gravity. Something like a 2700 or 3000 milliamp hour pack in that model will give a much better central gravity, and personally I would always recommend using a heavier battery to get CG, because that heavier battery has more capacity and it'll give you a longer flight time. Using things like lead weights is just dead weight, literally, that's not going to provide you with any longer flying. But that central gravity has to balance. If the central gravity is too far back, the plane will be almost unflyable. Even experienced pilots will really struggle to bring that in one piece. If the central gravity is too near the nose, then it'll still fly, but you'll find that it'll won't fly as nicely. So spend your time just balancing it on your fingertips and getting that absolutely spot on. It's a really key part of fixed wing setup, and you ignore it at your peril. So we're nearly there. Next couple of things then would be to balance the prop, pop it on, make sure that the prop is on the right way round. As multi-rotor pilots, you'll always have the text or any printing on the prop facing upwards. That is because the direction of travel, if you want to think of it like it, is always on the side that has the printing. So on something like a Bixler where it's a pusher prop, i.e. it's not pulling at the front, it's not a tractor, so it isn't at the front of the model pulling the model along, it's actually on the back of the model pushing. So in that instance, still mount it so that any printing on the prop is facing forwards. Make sure everything's nice and tight. Test your failsafe on the bench so that you can turn your radio off and the motor stops. And then once we're ready for that, we can go to the field. First flight I did with James, just to get that initial confidence, because at this point, remember, James is very much in a bad place about fixed wing. He'd had nothing but problems. He'd managed, the most he'd flown was a 2-minute flight, and everything else had ended in disaster, and lots of money been wasted with crashes. So the first time I said, well, what I'll do is let me throw it. So I would recommend, if you have a buddy that can go out, that can actually just throw the plane as though he's, you know, throwing a paper airplane, have somebody that can give you a hand with that. It's not a disaster if you have to do it yourself, but that very first time, having someone else that can throw the plane, so you've always got your fingers on the sticks, can be very useful and help you get over that initial hump. My advice for multi-rotor pilots, the big tip here is forget the rudder. In a multi-rotor, the rudder is really essential for changing direction, and planes, although the rudder will work like that, it's trying to train your brain out of not using the rudder to change direction in the same way. In a plane, if you bank using the aileron and pull the elevator back, it will actually turn around. So that's the way that you tend to turn. Now, there are coordinated turns where you use the rudder as well, but I would say when you're starting out, just leave the rudder alone. Once you have taken off, leave the throttle at the 50% position, the cruising position, and just use in a Mode 2 radio the right stick with elevator and aileron just to fly around. Now, when the plane's initially thrown, with all the control surfaces in those neutral positions, even with the center of gravity spot on, you'll probably have to trim the plane a little bit. Now, trimming the plane, those little things by the side of the radio, by the side of the sticks, are there to put a little bit of input. Now, we normally don't go anywhere near those if we're using a multi-rotor, but they're there for fixed wing aircraft. So you'll normally find that because the prop is spinning one way, there'll be a torque on the rest of the model trying to twist it in the opposite way. So you'll need a little bit of aileron input just to make it fly straight and level. Otherwise, it will tend to list in kind of the opposite direction that the prop is turning. That's quite normal, and there's usually a couple of clicks of elevator trim just to make sure that the nose is moving, the nose is staying level rather than going up and down. Now, the way you usually trim, for example, is if to keep the plane flying straight and level, you have to put the stick on the radio slightly to the right side. Then what you do is you move the aileron trim. I do 2 or 3 clicks at a time, just in the same direction. And then when you take your hands off the stick, the plane should fly straight and level. You'll find it's an iterative process. You might have to do that 3 or 4 times until you get it dialed in. Flying in wind is going to make this a lot more difficult, so I would always recommend trying to do it on a calm day. So just work your way around, and you'll know it's trimmed when you can take your fingers off the sticks with the plane flying straight and level, and it will continue to fly straight and level. Once you've got that done, then I would just concentrate on flying around in circles and figure eights. Keep your reasonable height, about 100, 120 feet, something like that is good. There's a rule of 3 mistakes high. So if you do make a mistake, you've got a chance to recover it, because if you make one mistake and then in panic make another mistake, you've still got a chance of catching it before it hits the ground. So don't try and fly too low. With bigger models like the Bixler 3, it presents a lovely silhouette. It has very clear decals on the underneath and on the top, so you know which side you're looking at. Keep it about 120 feet. Make sure you don't get too far away, and just fly around gently, using the elevator to maintain your height and the aileron to turn. Once your brain starts to fry, typically about 5 to 10 minutes, then it's time to land. Now, to land, all you do is you let the plane sink down, And don't worry about landing in a specific spot. Make sure you've got a reasonably open area. And I tend to do it so that as you're coming in, make sure you're nice and level, about 6 feet, 2 meters off the ground, cut the throttle. These kind of models float and will glide beautifully, and just let it sink into the grass, and you've got your first flight done. And that is this image of James. He had just completed that first flight and he was absolutely over the moon. Now James has a little bit of confidence. The next flight I said, okay, well this time I'll throw it, you can launch it, because now it's going to be trimmed, it's going to fly straight and level. All he has to do is pull the nose up, maybe give a little bit more throttle, and it'll climb away beautifully. So again, do another high five check, make sure that it's all working at the field. I always recommend doing that before you fly. Just make sure that nothing's happened. It's amazing, sometimes landing, something will happen with a servo, or one of the connectors will get popped off or damaged or broken. So do that. You want to find that on the ground, not after somebody's thrown it and it's flying over somebody's house or something else. James was talking to me as he was doing this second flight. This is the footage here, and the feedback from James is quite typical for a multi-rotor pilot. He was surprised at the sluggishness response of the model, and that is absolutely expected. We haven't got a multi-rotor running beta flight that's changing the prop in a fraction of a second to try and give us the most crisp response. What we're doing here is we're moving a piece of foam in an airflow that's then going to push that control surface in the opposite direction, and there's momentum that we have to overcome. We're back to kind of good old-fashioned physics here, so when you put an input in, there is a slight delay in it happening, and that is part of the change that you have to think about. So remember, we're kind of forgetting about the rudder still. We're still just turning around with aileron and elevator, so that's one of the big things as multi-rotor pilots you have to think about. Second here is that the reaction isn't instant. And also, if you let go of the sticks on a properly trimmed plane, it should continue to fly straight and level. So all you're really doing is you're putting in the correction. You kind of point the plane in the direction that you want, rather than in something like acro mode in beta flight, where you're having to really kind of fly and catch it all the time. And any increase and change in the controls is going to give an immediate response if your PID tune is good. That's not what this is. So be prepared for that and start to get used to that delayed reaction to the plane. You can reduce that delayed reaction by reducing the amount of expo and increasing the throws on the control surfaces. But I wouldn't do that until you have at least a dozen or 20 flights under your belt and it's starting to feel very, very comfortable indeed. A couple of other things that I'd recommend while you're doing these first flights. Remember that when you start to climb, what will happen is as you pull the nose up, the craft will actually start to slow down, and as it gets too slow, what will happen is a stall. Now a stall is where there's not enough wind or air flowing over the aerofoil of the wing to produce the lift it needs, and what happens is the nose drops down quite dramatically. Now the nice thing about these Bixlers, and again another reason why I recommend them for beginners, is that their stall characteristics are very gentle. All that happens when they stall is the nose drops. In smaller planes, the stall can be very aggressive, and what will happen is rather than just the nose dropping, one of the wings will completely stall out and the thing will fall over and it'll start to roll and twist, and that is hard for a professional pilot to recover, but it is almost impossible if you're not expecting it for a new pilot. So when you want to increase height, just give it a little bit more throttle, just 10-15%, pull the nose up and it will continue to rise. And if you're finding that it's doing that all the time, then that probably means that you just need a little bit more throttle, or your center of gravity is wrong, so double check it. And again, once you've had enough of that, then land in exactly the same way. So I must say a very big thank you to James for allowing me to use this footage. Hopefully that's going to be interesting for those of you multi-rotor pilots that are moving into fixed wing and maybe having a tough time. I've made this video because I know that James hasn't been on his own with these kind of problems, because I've had these other messages from other people. But if you have any questions or comments or want to see more of these kinds of videos, then please let me know down below. And to all of you who are about to take hopefully another bash at the fixed wing flying and you're a multi-rotor pilot today, hopefully that video has helped, and best of luck. Thanks for watching the video and watching right to the very end. You can find me in all the usual places on social media, and if you like the video and like what I'm doing here, then hit the subscribe button and hit the bell notification icon too. If you really like what I'm doing, you can go the extra mile and become one of my Patreons for access to me directly for support, and also giveaways and regular updates too. If you're looking for particular content, then check out the playlist. I organise all of my videos into playlists, so if you're looking for a particular topic, you can find everything here. If it's called Introduction To, it's designed to start very simply and build on that simple introduction to teach you all about it. If it's called For Beginners, then that is really aimed at people who are brand new to that part of the hobby. You can also search on YouTube for anything that you're interested in using the search function at the top. So iNav Painless 360 will find all of my videos and even the playlist around iNav. So thanks again for watching and happy flying.